I was standing beside Ernest's casket when my phone lit up with an unknown number. The message read, "I am still alive. Trust no one, especially Charles and Henry." My hands trembled as I read it twice. After 42 years of marriage, someone was telling me my dead husband was alive. The funeral director was already discussing the insurance papers with our sons. I watched Charles and Henry exchanging glances near the flowers. Something felt wrong. I took a deep breath. Right there, surrounded by mourners, I made a decision that would change everything. I slipped the phone into my purse and smiled at my sons. But there was something they didn't know about their mother. My name is Margot, and I was about to discover the truth about my family that no wife should ever have to face. That message haunted me through the entire service. I kept the phone in my purse, checking it every few minutes to make sure I hadn't imagined those words. I am still alive. Trust no one, especially Charles and Henry. The funeral director handed me papers to sign while people filed past Ernest's casket. I watched my sons accept condolences with dry eyes and firm handshakes. Charles wore his expensive suit, the one he'd bought for his last promotion. Henry kept checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. After everyone left, I sat alone in our living room for the first time in 42 years. The house felt different without Ernest's presence. I walked through each room, touching the things we'd collected together. His reading glasses on the kitchen table, the coffee mug he'd used that last morning, his work boots by the back door, still caked with sawdust from the workshop. That's when I really started thinking about what Charles had told me at the hospital. "Mom, Dad was working late on a custom cabinet when the gas line exploded," he'd said, his voice steady and rehearsed. "The whole workshop went up in flames. There wasn't much left. But when I drove past the workshop the next day, I couldn't see any damage. The building stood intact, windows unbroken, no scorch marks on the walls. I parked across the street and stared at it for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That evening, I pulled out the old photo albums. Ernest and I had met at a church social in Spring Creek when I was 24. He was 26, working construction and saving every penny to start his own carpentry business. I remembered our first dance, how nervous he was, stepping on my feet twice before finding his rhythm. We were married 6 months later, in a simple ceremony at St. Mary's. My dress cost $30 from Sears, and Ernest wore his father's suit with new shoes he'd polished until they gleamed. Our early years were lean but happy. Ernest worked 16-hour days building his client base while I took in sewing to help pay the bills. We lived in a tiny apartment above Miller's hardware store, sharing one bedroom and a kitchenette that barely fit a card table. On Sundays, we'd walk through the residential neighborhoods, dreaming about the house we'd own someday. Ernest would point out architectural details, explaining how crown molding was installed or why certain windows were better for natural light. When Charles was born, we moved into this house on Maple Street. It wasn't much, a 2-bedroom craftsman with original hardwood floors and a kitchen from the 1940s. But Ernest saw potential where I saw peeling paint and leaky pipes. He spent every weekend for 2 years renovating, teaching himself plumbing and electrical work from library books. Charles would follow him around, barely walking but fascinated by the tools and the sounds of construction. Henry came along 3 years later, and our family felt complete. Ernest built bunk beds for the boys' room, carving their names into the headboards with decorative flourishes. Weekend mornings meant pancakes in the kitchen, while Ernest read them stories from the newspaper comics. He'd do different voices for each character, making the boys giggle until they couldn't breathe. Those were precious times, when laughter filled every corner of our small house. The boys grew up understanding the value of hard work. Every summer, they helped Ernest in the workshop, learning to measure twice and cut once, to respect their tools, to take pride in creating something beautiful with their hands. Charles showed natural talent for woodworking, but he lost interest when he reached high school. He wanted to focus on academic subjects that would get him into a good college. Henry was more mechanical, drawn to engines and electrical systems, but he drifted away from manual work as he got older too. I remember the first time Charles expressed embarrassment about our home. He was 17, bringing a girlfriend over for dinner. After she left, he asked if we could get new furniture for the living room. "Something more modern," he said. "Jennifer's house has leather sofas and a big screen TV." Ernest explained patiently that we were saving money for Charles's college tuition, that our furniture was solid and comfortable, that appearances weren't as important as family time spent together. Charles rolled his eyes and walked away. Henry started making similar comments around the same time. He'd compare our one bathroom to friends' houses with multiple bathrooms and walk-in closets. He asked why we didn't have central air conditioning, why Ernest drove an old pickup truck instead of a newer car, why we shopped at discount stores instead of the mall. Ernest would remind them about priorities, about the difference between wants and needs, about being grateful for what we had. But the boys had stopped listening. College changed them both permanently. Charles studied business and came home talking about market opportunities and investment strategies. He'd critique Ernest's workshop methods, suggesting ways to increase efficiency and profit margins. Henry studied engineering and became fascinated with technology, constantly upgrading his phone and computer while dismissing anything that seemed outdated. They both started using phrases like keeping up with the times and maximizing potential. The real shift happened after they graduated and started their careers. Charles got a job with a consulting firm in the city, earning more in his first year than Ernest made in 2. Henry landed a position with a tech company, developing software for manufacturing processes. They moved into expensive apartments, bought designer clothes, and started dating women who shared their tastes for upscale restaurants and weekend getaways. When they visited us, which became increasingly rare, they seemed uncomfortable in their childhood home. The pressure started subtly. Charles would mention retirement communities he'd researched, places with medical services and social activities for seniors. Henry talked about the benefits of downsizing, how maintaining an old house was becoming too much work for aging parents. They brought up these topics during holidays and family dinners, presenting their suggestions as caring concern for our well-being. Ernest would change the subject, but I could see how their words affected him. Last Christmas, things escalated. Charles arrived with brochures for assisted living facilities, spreading them across our dining room table like he was presenting a business proposal. "Mom, Dad, you need to start thinking practically about your future," he said. "This house is too big, too old, too much work. These places offer everything you need in a safe, managed environment." Ernest's face went red, but he kept his voice calm. "Son, this is our home. We're not ready to leave it." Charles gathered up the brochures with a frustrated sigh. "You're being stubborn. We're trying to help you make smart decisions." Henry joined the campaign with a different approach, focusing on finances. He questioned Ernest about retirement savings, insurance policies, and the value of our property. He brought over real estate agents without asking, scheduling appointments to assess our house for market sale. When Ernest canceled these meetings, Henry accused him of being unrealistic about their financial situation. "Dad, you can't ignore the numbers forever," he said. "This house is your biggest asset. You should use it while you can." The last conversation I had with Ernest about the boys was 3 weeks before his death. We were sitting on the front porch after dinner, watching Mrs. Patterson water her garden across the street. Ernest seemed tired, older than his 68 years. "Margot, I never imagined our boys would turn out like this," he said quietly. "I don't know where we went wrong." I took his hand, feeling the calluses from 40 years of carpentry work. "We didn't go wrong, Ernest. We raised them with love and values. What they chose to do with that is their responsibility." He was quiet for a long moment, then squeezed my hand. "I've been thinking about making some changes to our insurance policies. Maybe setting up a trust. I want to make sure you're protected if something happens to me." I told him not to worry about such morbid topics, that we had many good years ahead of us. But Ernest had always been a planner, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Promise me something, Margot. If anything ever happens to me, don't let the boys rush you into any decisions. Take your time, think things through, and don't be afraid to get help from someone you trust. Now, sitting in our quiet house with that mysterious message on my phone, Ernest's words took on new meaning. I walked upstairs to his dresser, where he kept important papers in an old cigar box. Insurance policies, birth certificates, our marriage license, deed to the house. Everything seemed normal until I found a business card tucked behind our wedding photo. Stephen Callahan, private investigator. On the back, Ernest had written a phone number and the date from 3 weeks ago. I stared at that card for a long time, my heart beating faster with each passing minute. Ernest had hired a private investigator 3 weeks before his death, the same time frame when he'd talked about protecting me, about not trusting the boys' intentions. I thought about Charles's rehearsed explanation of the accident, Henry's eagerness to discuss funeral arrangements, their cold behavior at the hospital. The message on my phone suddenly seemed less impossible and more terrifying. The next morning, I called Stephen Callahan. His office was in downtown Spring Creek, above Murphy's Deli, in a building I'd walked past hundreds of times. When I explained who I was, his voice became gentle but serious. "Mrs. Hayes, I was expecting your call. Your husband hired me to investigate your son's activities. He was concerned about their behavior, their financial pressures, and their increased interest in your family assets. I have information that you need to see, but not over the phone. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, unable to eat or concentrate on anything. I kept returning to that message, reading it over and over. If Ernest was alive, where was he? If he wasn't, who had sent those words? And why would they warn me specifically about Charles and Henry? By noon, I couldn't wait any longer. I drove to Stephen's office, my hands shaking as I climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor. Stephen Callahan was nothing like I'd imagined. He was probably 55, with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing a simple button-down shirt and khakis. His office was small but organized, with filing cabinets along one wall and a desk covered with neat stacks of papers. He offered me coffee and a chair facing his desk, then sat down with a thick folder marked with Ernest's name. "Mrs. Hayes, what I'm about to show you will be difficult to hear," he began. "Your husband came to me because he suspected your sons were planning something harmful. He'd noticed unusual activity in your joint bank accounts, new insurance policies taken out without his knowledge, and conversations between Charles and Henry that concerned him greatly. He asked me to investigate, and what I discovered confirms his worst fears." Stephen opened the folder and spread out photographs, bank statements, and typed reports. The first thing he showed me was a copy of a life insurance policy I'd never seen before, with Ernest as the insured and Charles and Henry as beneficiaries. The policy was worth $500,000 and had been purchased just 2 months ago. "Your sons forged your signatures on the application," Stephen explained. "They also opened a credit line against your house without your knowledge, using funds to pay gambling debts and credit card balances." The photographs were even more damning. Stephen had surveillance images of Charles meeting with a man outside a chemical supply company, purchasing containers of methanol. Other photos showed Henry at the hospital where Ernest died, talking with a doctor in the parking garage, exchanging what appeared to be an envelope of money. The final image was of both brothers at a lawyer's office, signing documents related to guardianship proceedings for incapacitated adults. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband didn't die in an explosion," Stephen said quietly. "He was poisoned with methanol, which causes symptoms that mimic a heart attack. The explosion story was fabricated to explain why there wasn't a body to examine closely. Your son staged the entire scenario, bribing a doctor to falsify the death certificate and using their connections to rush through the cremation without proper investigation. I felt the room spinning around me. Everything I'd believed about Ernest's death was a lie. My own sons had murdered their father for insurance money, then manipulated me through my grief to cover their tracks. The coffee cup slipped from my hands, shattering on the floor, but I barely noticed. Stephen gave me tissues and waited patiently while I processed what he'd told me. "There's more," he said gently. "I have recordings of your sons planning not just your husband's murder, but yours as well. They intend to have you declared mentally incompetent, gain guardianship of your assets, then arrange for your death to look like suicide. They've already started the process, scheduling psychiatric evaluations and meeting with lawyers about conservatorship proceedings." Stephen played portions of the recordings on a small device. I heard Charles's voice clearly. "Once we get control of her finances, it's just a matter of time. A few months in the facility to establish the mental health narrative, then we stage it to look like she couldn't handle Dad's death." Henry's response chilled me to the bone. "The life insurance plus the house should clear all our debts and leave plenty for the future. Mom won't suffer long." I sat in that office for 3 hours, listening to evidence that my sons had planned and executed their father's murder, then began planning mine. Stephen had dozens of recordings, photographs of meetings with corrupt medical professionals, copies of forged documents, and financial records showing how they'd already begun stealing from our accounts. The scope of their betrayal was overwhelming, but the evidence was undeniable. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband suspected what was happening, but he needed proof before he could act," Stephen explained. "He was gathering evidence to protect you and expose them. The night he died, he called me to say he had discovered something important and would bring it to my office the next morning. That call never came, but he had already given me instructions about what to do if something happened to him. The message you received at the funeral was sent from a phone he gave me, with specific words he wanted you to hear. Ernest had known they were planning to kill him. He'd spent his final weeks not just gathering evidence, but preparing to save me from the same fate. The message at the funeral was his way of reaching me from beyond the grave, warning me not to trust our sons, and letting me know that help was available." I felt a mixture of grief and rage, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My husband had died trying to protect me, and our sons had looked me in the eye while planning my murder. Stephen outlined what needed to happen next. We had enough evidence to prove murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and elder abuse. The recordings were admissible in court, the financial documents showed clear patterns of theft, and the medical evidence would expose the corrupted death certificate. But we needed to move carefully, because Charles and Henry were already implementing their plan to have me declared incompetent. "They've scheduled a psychiatric evaluation for you next week," Stephen said, showing me forged medical forms. "The doctor they've chosen has a history of providing false diagnoses for financial gain. If you attend that appointment, they'll use whatever he says to begin guardianship proceedings. We need to contact law enforcement immediately and turn over all this evidence before they can complete their plan." I thought about Ernest's final words to me, about taking my time and getting help from someone I could trust. He'd already arranged for that help through Stephen, anticipating exactly what would happen after his death. My husband had loved me enough to spend his final weeks ensuring my survival, even knowing it might cost him his life. Now it was my responsibility to honor his sacrifice by bringing our sons to justice. The next morning, Stephen and I met with Sergeant O'Connell at the Spring Creek Police Department. The evidence filled 2 large boxes, and it took over an hour to present everything systematically. The sergeant listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting specific documents. When we finished, he sat back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything quite like this," he said. "The premeditation, the complexity, the complete betrayal of family trust. This isn't a crime of passion or desperation. This is calculated, cold-blooded murder followed by an elaborate cover-up and plans for additional murder. We'll need to coordinate with the district attorney's office, but I can tell you right now that we have more than enough evidence for arrest warrants. Within 24 hours, everything moved into action. The district attorney's office assigned their most experienced prosecutor to the case. Detective Reynolds began coordinating with the state crime lab for additional forensic analysis, and Judge Morrison signed arrest warrants for both Charles and Henry. To prevent them from destroying evidence or fleeing, the arrests were scheduled for dawn, with simultaneous raids on their apartments and a search of Ernest's workshop. I waited at Stephen's office while the arrests took place, too nervous to stay home, but too emotionally drained to go anywhere else. At 8:30 that morning, Sergeant O'Connell called to report that both sons were in custody. Charles had been found at his apartment, still in his pajamas, completely shocked when officers broke down his door. Henry had tried to run when he saw police cars in his building's parking lot, but they caught him in the stairwell with a suitcase full of cash and forged identity documents. The interrogations lasted all day. Charles initially denied everything, claiming the evidence was fabricated and that I was suffering from grief-induced delusions. But when detectives played the recordings of his voice planning both murders, his composure cracked completely. He broke down crying, alternating between claiming innocence and blaming Henry for leading him into the scheme. Henry, meanwhile, refused to speak without a lawyer and maintained his silence even when confronted with photographic evidence of his activities. 3 days later, I had to face them in court for the arraignment. They sat at separate tables with their lawyers, both wearing orange jail uniforms and shackles. Charles looked haggard and defeated, staring at his hands throughout the proceedings. Henry glared at me with pure hatred, his jaw clenched tight as the charges were read aloud. First-degree murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, elder abuse, forgery, theft. The list seemed endless. When the prosecutor played excerpts from the recordings in open court, gasps echoed through the gallery. Family friends who had attended out of curiosity sat in stunned silence as they heard Charles and Henry discussing methods for poisoning their father and staging my suicide. Several people left the courtroom in tears, unable to process what they were hearing. Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor of 20 years, covered her mouth with her hands and sobbed openly. The judge set bail at $2 million each, effectively ensuring they would remain in custody until trial. Charles's wife Jasmine approached me afterward, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Hayes, I swear I didn't know," she pleaded. "I knew Charles was stressed about money, but I never imagined he could do something like this. Please forgive me. Please don't blame me for what he did." I looked at her for a long moment. This young woman I'd welcomed into our family, who had shared holiday meals at our table and called me Mom for the past 5 years. "Jasmine, I don't hold you responsible for Charles's choices," I said quietly, "but I can't have you in my life anymore. The trust is broken, and it can't be repaired. I wish you well, but we won't be seeing each other again." She nodded through her tears and walked away, and I felt a piece of my heart break for the innocent relationships that had been destroyed by my son's actions. The trial took place 6 months later, drawing media attention from across the state. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, curious locals, and family crime researchers studying the case. I testified for 3 hours, describing my son's behavior, their pressure to sell the house, their coldness after their father's supposed death, and the fear I felt when I learned the truth about their plans. The prosecutor played the complete recordings, showing financial documents on large screens, and bringing in expert witnesses to explain the methanol poisoning process. Charles's defense attorney tried to argue that he was manipulated by Henry, that he was weak-willed and easily influenced by his more aggressive brother. Henry's lawyer claimed the recordings were taken out of context, that the brothers were only discussing hypothetical scenarios and never intended actual harm. But the evidence was overwhelming, the timeline was clear, and the premeditation was undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Morrison sentenced both men to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling their crimes a betrayal of the most fundamental bonds of human decency and family trust. As the sentences were read, Charles collapsed in his chair while Henry stared straight ahead with no expression at all. 6 months after the trial, I received a phone call from the prison warden. Charles had been found dead in his cell, having hanged himself with torn bed sheets. He left no note, no final words, no expression of remorse or apology. Just silence and an empty cell. I felt nothing when I heard the news, no grief or relief, just a hollow acknowledgement that my eldest son was gone. Henry suffered a complete mental breakdown shortly after, attacking guards and other inmates in violent rages. He was transferred to a prison psychiatric facility where doctors said he had developed paranoid delusions and would likely never recover. With the insurance money and the funds recovered from my son's theft, I established the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Family Crime Victims. Working with Stephen, who became the foundation's lead investigator, we provided legal assistance, private investigation services, and emotional support for people betrayed by their own relatives. Our first major case involved a daughter who had been slowly poisoning her mother with insulin to accelerate her inheritance. Using techniques learned from my own experience, we gathered evidence that led to conviction and saved the mother's life. The foundation grew quickly, handling cases of financial elder abuse, inheritance fraud, and family violence. We worked with law enforcement agencies to identify patterns of family crime, trained social workers to recognize warning signs, and lobbied for stronger legal protections for vulnerable family members. Within 3 years, we had helped secure convictions in over 40 cases and recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets for victims. I kept living in our house on Maple Street, the home Ernest and I had shared for 38 years. I converted his workshop into a garden room, filled with flowering plants and comfortable chairs where I could sit and remember better times. Every Sunday, I drove to Greenwood Cemetery to put fresh flowers on Ernest's grave. I would tell him about the foundation's work, about the people we'd helped, about the justice we'd achieved in his memory. Stephen visited me every week, usually on Thursday evenings, bringing updates about current cases and sharing quiet dinners in my kitchen. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Nothing romantic, but deeply meaningful. He had lost his own parents to family financial abuse years earlier, which drove his dedication to this type of investigation work. Together, we had created something positive from the ashes of betrayal and murder. 5 years after Ernest's death, the town held a memorial ceremony in his honor. Over 200 people attended, including families we had helped through the foundation, law enforcement officers we had worked with, and neighbors who remembered Ernest as a kind and honest man. Stephen gave a speech about the legacy of justice that had grown from tragedy, how Ernest's final act of protecting his wife had rippled outward to help dozens of other families. I stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at faces I recognized and many I didn't, all brought together by the story of love, betrayal, and ultimate justice. Ernest always believed that family wasn't defined by blood, but by loyalty, love, and shared values, I said. Our biological sons chose greed over family bonds, betrayal over love, murder over compassion. But this room is filled with the family Ernest and I actually had, people who understand that protecting each other is what family really means. The ceremony concluded with the dedication of a memorial garden at the community center, funded by foundation donations and maintained by local volunteers. A bronze plaque read, "In memory of Ernest Hayes, whose love protected his family even beyond death, and whose legacy continues to serve justice for all families." As I touched his name on that plaque, I felt the peace that comes from knowing that evil had not won, that love had found a way to triumph, even in the face of unthinkable betrayal. Today, I live quietly, but purposefully. The foundation continues its work under Stephen's daily management, while I serve as an advisor and spokesperson. I have learned that blood relationships create no obligations when those relationships become toxic and dangerous. Charles and Henry chose their paths, and I chose mine. Ernest's memory lives on not in grief or anger, but in the protection and justice we provide for other families facing similar betrayals. Every morning, I water the flowers in my garden room and read letters from people the foundation has helped. A grandmother in Texas whose nephew was stealing her Social Security checks, a widower in Ohio whose daughter had forged his will, an elderly couple in Florida whose son had convinced doctors they were mentally incompetent to steal their savings. Each letter reminds me that our work matters, that Ernest's sacrifice continues to save lives and preserve families. I have established clear boundaries that protect my peace and honor my husband's memory. No family member who betrays trust receives forgiveness or access to my life. No financial predator escapes consequences if I can prevent it. No victim of family crime faces their battle alone if the foundation can help. These are not angry boundaries, but practical ones, designed to create safety for myself and others who have faced similar betrayal. The house on Maple Street remains my sanctuary, filled with 42 years of genuine love and memories that no amount of betrayal can erase. I have transformed it into a place of healing, where foundation clients can meet privately, where Stephen and I plan our investigations, where the true meaning of family continues to flourish. This is my micro-purpose, to use everything Ernest and I built together as a foundation for protecting other families from the kind of evil that destroyed our sons but could not destroy our love. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us most can cause the deepest pain, but I learned that real family is built on loyalty and trust, not blood. And that was how I discovered that even in the darkest betrayal, love finds a way to create something meaningful. If this story touched you, please subscribe. I have many more to share.